ever get that feeling? Like you're carefully pulling apart some idea, really trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, bam, you just find another layer.
Right.
Another layer of complexity just staring back at you. It can be a bit daunting, right? Well, that's kind of what we're dealing with today. We're diving into the work of C.D. Broad, a philosopher who, I think it's fair to say, embraced complexity.
He did.
Yeah.
Charlie Dunbar Broad, a remarkable mind, active from the late 1800s right through 1971.
Wow!
Spent his career wrestling with some of the thorniest problems philosophy has to offer.
And a long time at Cambridge, too, right? At Trinity College.
Trinity College, Cambridge, yes. A real breeding ground for intense philosophical debate, you could say.
What always gets me about Broad is his starting point. I mean, here's a guy with a scholarship in science, at Trinity no less.
Impressive.
Right? Set on a path in science and math. But then he makes this incredibly self-aware move. He basically decides, look, I might not be a top-tier scientist. So philosophy it is. That kind of honesty, that willingness to really assess his own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
I think that says a lot about his approach to thinking in general.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it? And it's reflected in the sheer scope of his philosophical work. You name a major area of philosophy, Broad probably tackled it.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you list it all out.
Mind and body, perception, memory, the whole mystery of the unconscious. Then you've got the fundamentals. Space, time, causation. And it doesn't stop there, right? Ethics, the history of philosophy, even dips his toes into the philosophy of religion.
It's like he wasn't afraid of any question, no matter how big.
Precisely. And not just a superficial glance at these topics either. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it well. Disinterested curiosity and scrupulous care.
Those are the words.
That's how he approached it all.
Wait.
Even parapsychology, something many dismiss out of hand, Broad examines it with that same rigor.
So, for our listeners, many of whom are philosophers themselves,
Of course.
it's important to understand that Broad wasn't about building some grand system. Right. His own personal philosophy in that sense. He actually said so himself.
Yeah.
He was more about really digging into the existing theories, picking them apart, seeing where they held up and where they crumbled.
That's where the brilliance lies. The depth of analysis.
It's like that A.J. Ayer quote, remember?
Oh, yeah.
The subject is discussed from every angle. Nothing is skimped. Looking for reason, we are not fobbed off with rhetoric.
Perfect summary. Broad lays it all out, every possibility, traces the arguments back to their roots, and then meticulously exposes any weaknesses.
No stone unturned.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And his own intellectual journey, you can see how it was shaped by the giants of Cambridge.
Oh, yeah.
Russell and Moore, of course, but also McTaggart and W.E. Johnson. Later, at St. Andrews, he's exposed to Stout and Taylor.
A real mix of influences there.
Which comes through in his own work. Broad's range is just incredible.
When you read about his life outside of academia, it's almost like stark contrast.
How so?
I mean, he compared it himself to the life of a monk in a monastery. Dedicated, focused.
He had his passions, though.
Oh, right. His love for Sweden, those yearly trips after that first one in 46.
And his time in the States, those visiting professorships at Michigan and UCLA.
Yeah, and even then he kind of downplayed it, saying he enjoyed being treated as a great philosopher.
So,
humble, right.
A hint of irony there, perhaps.
Yeah.
But also a sense of genuine humility, I think.
So for this deep dive, what we're aiming to do, I think, is to get into some of those key concepts, the arguments that Broad spent so much time with.
And see what we can take from them. What's still relevant, what still makes us think.
Exactly. And especially for our listeners, many of whom are, grappling with these same issues, maybe in their own philosophical work.
Good point.
Okay, let's start with perception. Broad is considered a major figure in representational realism, right?
He is.
Which I always find kind of fascinating middle ground.
Between naive realism and those more, shall we say, radical forms of idealism.
Right. It's not saying that we're completely cut off from the world out there, but it's also not saying that what we see is exactly what is...
Exactly. Yeah. Broad argued for a kind of indirectness, a mediation through what he called sensa.
Sensa. Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Think of a simple example. You're looking at a coin, but you're holding it at an angle.
Okay, got it.
What you're seeing, that shape in your visual field, it's not a perfect circle.
Right. More like an oval, elliptical.
That elliptical shape, that's the sensum. That's the immediate sensory data.
So it's not the coin itself, but our representation of it.
In a way, yes. That's the key point. What we're directly aware of isn't necessarily the object as it exists out there in the world.
That can be tough to wrap your head around, though.
It is a departure from our common sense view.
Which Broad calls, what is it, naive realism?
Naive realism, exactly. It's that intuitive idea that we just perceive things directly.
Like, I see a bell, I hear the bell, I'm experiencing the bell.
Right. That immediate connection, no middleman, so to speak.
But Broad points out, even if we accept naive realism, there's still a problem.
There is.
We never experience the whole object all at once, do we?
Good point. Even in the most straightforward perception, there are always hidden aspects.
Like, I'm looking at this mug on my desk. I see the front, the handle, but I don't see the bottom. I don't feel its temperature right now.
So even the naive realist has to admit we're only getting a partial view.
A part that's, what did he say?
Sensuously manifested.
Right. But Broad says there's more to it than just this part that we're sensing. He talks about intentional content or external reference. What's that all about?
Crucial concept. It means that even though we only sense a part, that part is experienced as belonging to something larger. We perceive it as part of a whole that has a bunch of properties we're not currently sensing.
Okay, so in my mug example, I'm sensing the handle, the color, but my experience also represents it as a complete mug.
Exactly, with a bottom, an inside, maybe some coffee in it, even if I don't see those things right now.
And this external reference, Broad is clear, it's not some conscious inference.
No, not like we're thinking, oh, okay, this handle must be part of a mug. It's built into the experience itself.
So it's not reasoning, it's just how we perceive.
More fundamental than that, I'd say.
Which leads us to prehension. This seems like a really big deal for Broad.
Absolutely central. It's how he explains this immediate awareness, but it's a tricky one to define.
Yeah, he even says so himself, right? He says you can't really define phrases like,
S prehends X as red. Something like that.
Right. So how do we understand what prehension even means?
Through contrast, I think. Broad distinguishes it from things like judging or knowing.
Give me an example.
Imagine, an apple's red, even in complete darkness. You've seen it before, you remember. But in the dark, you're not prehending it as red. You're not having that direct sensory experience.
So prehension is tied to the senses, to that immediate redness, not just knowing something is red.
Yes, and even a creature without concepts, say a dog, might prehend red without having the concept red.
Whoa, wait. So my dog looking at a red ball is actually experiencing redness, even if he doesn't have the word for it.
That's the idea. A fascinating distinction.
It is. So prehension is this basic level of sensory awareness, even before thought gets involved.
But it's not totally separate from knowledge either.
How so?
For a being with the right concepts, prehending something as red can lead to knowing it as red.
It's like a raw material for knowledge, then.
I like that analogy. The sensory foundation.
Okay, so we've got this initial intuitive, naive realism, and we've got this idea of prehension. Now, what leads Broad to think naive realism isn't quite right?
He presents some very powerful arguments against it.
Right, he doesn't just leave it at like, oh, that's a nice simple view. He really digs in.
Absolutely. The argument from hallucination, for example. Classic. Imagine someone, let's say they've had a bit too much to drink. They're hallucinating a pink rat.
I've never seen one myself, but I get the picture.
The point is, their experience, subjectively, it feels real to them.
As real as if there was a pink rat.
Exactly. And that's where the problem arises. Because in hallucination, there is no pink rat out there in the world.
So if the experience is the same, but the object isn't always there.
It suggests that the object itself isn't essential to the experience itself.
Like the experience can happen without the object being directly involved.
That's the inference Broad is making. And if that's true for hallucination...
Maybe that's true for normal perception, too.
It casts doubt on that direct connection that naive realism relies on.
Then there's the argument from illusion, right, that builds on this idea.
It does. Think of, we used the coin example before, the elliptical shape when you see it at an angle. The naive realist wants to say you're directly seeing the coin's surface.
But the shape's wrong.
Exactly. What's sensuously manifested, that elliptical shape, can be the actual circular surface of the coin.
So we must be seeing something else.
Some intermediary.
Yeah, you sense some.
Right, precisely. Same thing with, say, a white piece of paper that looks yellowish under a candle.
You're not seeing the paper's true whiteness.
Exactly. The immediately experienced color is different.
But, people push back on this, right? They say, yeah, but we know it's still a circle. We're not fooled.
Common objection. We understand the illusions, intellectually at least.
But Broad has an answer for that, right?
He does. He says, looking elliptical That's a specific type of experience.
It's not about being wrong about the shape. It's about how it appears.
Exactly. And that appearance, that's what challenges naive realism, whether we're intellectually fooled or not.
Makes sense. So the appearance itself is the problem.
And even when we factor in things like perceptual constancy,
which is like how our brain sort of adjusts for these changes, right?
when something moves further away, we don't perceive it as shrinking.
Right. We understand it's still the same size.
Broad acknowledges that, but he says it just moves the problem around.
Doesn't solve it completely.
There are always cases where constancy breaks down.
That makes sense. So Broad is pushing us towards this idea that our sensory experience isn't quite as straightforward as we might initially think.
It's mediated. There's something in between the object and our awareness of it.
Of course, the big worry with any kind of sense data theory is skepticism, right? If all we know are sensa, how do we know anything about the real world?
Broad was very aware of that concern.
Yeah.
He even admits it makes him uneasy.
But he doesn't just abandon the theory because of that.
He argues the evidence for sensa is too strong to ignore.
So how does he deal with that skepticism?
He tries to find a balance. He proposes that, yes, we only directly experience sensa.
Okay.
But material objects, those things out there in the world, they do have certain properties. He calls them primary qualities.
Like what?
Shape, size, position. Those exist independently of our perception.
Okay.
But secondary properties, things like color, heat, as we experience them.
Yeah.
He's more skeptical about those. He says objects might be red or hot.
But our experience might not be capturing those properties directly as they are in the object.
Exactly. There's this potential gap between how we experience things and how they actually are.
Okay, that's a pretty nuanced view. So if we're stuck with sensa, how does Broad explain sensation itself? Like what's going on when we sense something?
He actually compares two different ways of analyzing this. The act-object analysis, which he favors, and the adverbial analysis.
Can you break those down?
In the act-object view, there's an act of sensing and a sensum, which is the object of that act. So two components. The adverbial view, on the other hand, it tries to understand sensations as just modifications of our mental state. Like, instead of saying, I'm sensing a headache, they'd say something like, I'm in a headachy state of mind.
So it's about how our mind is not about a separate object of sensation.
Right. And Broad finds this plausible for bodily sensations.
Like headaches.
Yeah, those seem to fit that state of mind description. But for things like seeing and hearing,
it's like we're aware of something with properties, not just in a state.
Exactly. So he leans toward the act-object view for visual and auditory experiences.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. We've got these arguments against naive realism. We've got sensa playing this central role and this idea of an act of sensing directed at a sensum.
And all of this comes together in Broad's theory of representative perception.
Which is basically saying...
It's saying that our perceptual experience always has this intentional content.
It's about something.
Yes. And this experience includes the sensory phase, sensing the senses.
That's our direct access.
Right. But this intentional content, it goes beyond the senses themselves.
It's how we represent the object in the world based on those senses.
Precisely. And the idea of a physical object itself, Broad argues that's not something we learn from experience.
Bro.
It's more like an innate principle of interpretation. It's how we make sense of the sensory data.
So it's built in how we're wired to see the world.
That's the idea.
Okay, that's perception. Moving on, I think we have to talk about time.
Right. Another major theme for Broad's. And a complex one.
The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about 3 phases in Broad's philosophy of time, which already tells you there was some development in his thinking there.
Definitely. In his early work around 1921, he was firmly in the eternalist camp.
Okay, remind me what eternalism is all about.
Eternalism is the view that the past, present, and future are all equally real. No special status for the present.
It's all just
laid out along the timeline.
And this means he rejected presentism, the idea that only the present is real.
He called it mere rhetoric.
Wow, strong words. What were his main arguments against presentism?
2 main ones. First, he thought presentism got confused about what coexistence means.
Yeah, because it's true that everything doesn't happen at the same time.
Right. But Broad's point is the different parts of time, they still coexist in the sense of being part of this whole temporal reality.
Like they're all part of the same story, even if they happen at different points.
Exactly.
Huh?
His second argument was that presentism mistakes past, present, and future as if they were like properties of objects themselves.
As if an event is inherently past.
Instead of seeing them as relations, Temporal relations.
Relations between what?
Between mental states, like our awareness, and the objects of those states.
So it's about how we experience things in time, not about the things themselves being past or future.
Right. And Broad was really into Bertrand Russell's analysis of tense.
You just basically said
that tenses like is, was, will be, they can be broken down using a tenseless is plus some temporal relations.
So instead of saying it is raining,
you'd say something like it is raining at a moment simultaneous with my saying this.
Okay, so everything is just is, but located at different points in time.
And those temporal relations are what give us the tenses we use in language.
So that was Broad's early view, this eternalism where all time is equally real. But then he changes his mind, right? Moves to the growing block theory.
He does. By 1923, he's arguing that only the present and the past are actually real.
What happened to the future?
Simply nothing at all, he says.
So it hasn't happened? It doesn't exist yet?
That's the idea. And central to this growing block theory is this concept of temporal passage.
How did he explain that?
Through becoming, the process of events coming into existence.
So the present is real, the past is real because they've already become...
And the future is still potential. It hasn't become yet.
So the universe is like this block that's constantly growing as new moments become real.
And the transition from present to past, it's not about some movement.
It's about acquiring new relations as the block grows.
Exactly. New moments are added, and what was present becomes past in relation to those new moments.
It's a really intuitive picture, right? Like this ever-expanding block of reality.
It is. And during this period, he also criticizes the moving spotlight theory.
Which tries to hold on to eternalism, but add this idea of presentness moving through time, right?
Right, like a spotlight shining on different parts of the timeline.
What didn't Broad like about that?
He had a couple of objections. First, he said, if this spotlight is moving, that movement itself, that's an event happening in time.
So it should be part of the timeline, too.
And then you need another time for that movement to happen in, and so on.
Yeah.
It leads to this regress.
An infinite regress of time.
Precisely. His second argument was about the rate of passage.
If this spotlight is moving, how fast is it moving?
Exactly. How much time does it cover in a given unit of time? And again, this seems to lead to another regress.
So this idea of a moving spotlight, it's not as simple as it sounds.
Creates more problems than it solves, in Broad's view.
But even the growing block theory doesn't satisfy him in the end, does it?
It doesn't. In his later work, he talks about absolute becoming.
Okay, so third phase, new idea. What's that all about?
This is where he gets to what he calls the rock-bottom peculiarity of time.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's not just about things happening in order. It's about this continual supersession.
Supersession.
The latest phase of reality is constantly being replaced by a new one, which will then be replaced, and so on.
So it's not just change, it's this continual coming into being and passing away.
Precisely. And he thought this captured what was unique about time, what set it apart from other kinds of order, like spatial order.
And what did he see as the advantages of this view?
Well, for one, it avoids those tricky questions about the rate of passage.
Which plagued the moving spotlight theory.
Yes, and to some extent, even the growing block theory.
And what else?
It also gets rid of this implication that the past and future somehow coexist with the present, which he found problematic.
So it's a more radical view of time in a way, more focused on this constant change.
It is. It really emphasizes the dynamic, fleeting nature of reality.
That's quite a journey from eternalism to this idea of absolute becoming. It shows how much he wrestled with these fundamental concepts.
It does. And speaking of wrestling with concepts, we should talk about free will.
Oh, that's a big one. And Broad directly linked it to moral responsibility. Right?
Yes. In his inaugural lecture in 1934, he framed the whole debate in terms of moral responsibility and these ideas of ought and ought not.
Okay, so the classic question, if we ought to do something, does that mean we could have done otherwise?
Exactly. He starts with this widely accepted principle, ought implies could.
But the question is, what kind of could are we talking about?
Precisely. And he uses some very specific terms like obligable and substitutable actions.
Just to make sure we're all on the same page, can you define those?
Of course. An obligable action is one where it makes sense to say ought to be done or ought not to be done.
Okay, so it's about actions that are morally relevant.
Right. A substitutable action, on the other hand, is one that either was done but could have been left undone or vice versa.
So there was a genuine possibility of doing something else.
Exactly. And Broad's point is that for an action to be obligable, it has to be substitutable in some way.
Makes sense. You can't have a moral obligation to do something if you couldn't have done anything else.
He then goes on to focus on what he calls voluntary substitutability.
Okay, that's that.
This means that if the agent had willed or chosen to do something, they would have done it.
So if I had chosen to raise my left hand instead of my right, I would have raised my left hand.
Precisely. And Broad thought this was necessary for an action to be obligable.
But not sufficient, right? He uses that example of drug addiction to show why.
The morphine addicts.
Yeah. At first, they can choose not to take the drug. They can resist if they really want to.
But as the addiction gets worse, they might reach a point where they can't resist, even if they want to.
Even if they consciously wish they wouldn't take it.
And yet it might still be true to say that if they had willed not to take it, they wouldn't have.
So even though they would have acted differently if they had willed differently.
It doesn't mean they could have willed differently in the first place.
So this voluntary substitutability isn't enough for moral responsibility.
Because the ability to choose, to will, might be compromised.
This challenges that classic compatibilist view, right? Where could have done otherwise just means you would have if you had chosen differently.
It does. It pushes Broad towards a more demanding notion of what it means to have free will.
So if it's not just about willing differently, what else is needed?
He says we need not only voluntary substitutability,
Yeah.
but also the ability to have willed otherwise in the first place.
But what does that mean? Could have willed differently.
That's a tough one.
He rejects the idea of defining it in terms of past tendencies or dispositions.
Like, if I'm generally an honest person, I could have willed to tell the truth.
Because his concern is, if you couldn't have willed differently in the past,
Yeah.
then any talk about what you would have willed in the future becomes kind of meaningless.
Because it all goes back to that past inability.
And it could lead to this infinite regress of past willings determining the present one.
So he's not happy with these conditional analyses, both for acting and for willing.
It leads him to this much stronger idea, categorical substitutability.
What's that?
This is the idea that for an action to be obligable, to be something you ought to do,
Yeah.
it has to have been possible to avoid it in a way that goes beyond these would have if statements. So it's not about what you would have done under different circumstances.
It's about a deeper possibility, a possibility that doesn't depend on those hypotheticals.
Okay, I think I'm following. And this categorical substitutability has two conditions, right?
It does. A negative one and a positive one.
Lay those out for me.
The negative condition is that your willing wasn't totally determined by all the factors at play at that moment.
So there's some element of, like, not being completely predictable based on the situation.
But if an action meets only this condition, Broad calls it an accident.
So no real praise or blame because it wasn't a deliberate choice.
Right. Then there's the positive condition.
Which is?
This is where it gets really interesting. The positive condition says the willing has to be literally determined by the agent or self.
Not just by events happening within the agent, but by the agent themselves.
And this is agent causation.
Which is the idea that we as agents can be the cause of our own actions, not just responding to prior causes.
Precisely. But Broad, as you might expect, he doesn't just accept this easily.
He has problems with agent causation too, right? But it seems so intuitive. I mean, we feel like we're in control, like we decide.
It's a powerful intuition for sure. But Broad's main argument is that if something is caused, if it has a cause, then that cause has to include events, things that happen at particular times.
Okay.
And the agent, the self, it's not an event. It doesn't happen at a specific time.
It's more like the thing that persists through time.
So he struggles to see how this non-event, the agent, can cause something to happen at a particular time.
Like, how can I, as this timeless self, determine when exactly I raise my hand?
That's the puzzle. There seems to be a need for some event within me leading up to that action.
So where does this leave Broad on the whole free will question? It sounds like he's not very optimistic.
He's not. He ends up with what he calls free will pessimism. Meaning he doesn't think free will, at least the kind we need, for genuine moral responsibility.
Yeah. He doesn't think it's compatible with determinism. And he also doesn't think any of the indeterministic accounts, including agent causation, really work.
So he's basically saying free will, in the strong sense, might not exist.
That's his conclusion. A pretty challenging one, especially for those who believe in holding people truly responsible for their actions.
It's a problem that has plagued philosophers for centuries, and it seems Broad couldn't find a satisfactory answer either.
It's a testament to how deep and difficult this problem is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another area where Broad did a lot of work was emergentism, particularly in relation to the mind-body problem.
Yes, his defense of emergentism is another major contribution. He argues that mental properties are not reducible to physical properties.
Okay, so they're not just complex arrangements of matter, there's something new.
Right. They emerge at a certain level of complexity in physical systems, but they're not just the sum of the parts.
I'm really interested in this idea because it seems to offer a way out of that reductionist trap, the idea that everything is just physics at bottom. It does. And Broad's work on this is still very relevant today, especially in debates about consciousness.
So let's get into the details. How did Broad define an emergent property?
He had a very precise definition. He said, an emergent property is one that you can't logically infer even if you knew everything about the parts.
Okay, so even if I knew all the properties of all the atoms in my brain,
And how they interact in every possible way.
I still wouldn't be able to deduce the fact that I have conscious experiences.
If consciousness is emergent, that is. That's the key distinction. Properties that you can deduce from the parts.
Those are reducible.
And what he called the mechanistic theory, what we now call physicalism.
Yeah.
It denies the existence of any truly emergent properties.
Okay, so it's a fundamental disagreement about what kinds of properties can exist in the world.
And to make this clearer, Broad uses an example, a hypothetical one, about a biological property like nutrition.
How does nutrition fit into this?
Well, he says nutrition obviously depends on chemical processes.
Right, stuff happening at the molecular level.
But he suggests that it might not be reducible to those processes. Meaning, even if I knew all the chemistry involved, I couldn't necessarily predict that a system with those chemicals would exhibit nutrition.
It's something that emerges at a higher level of organization at the biological level.
And this is where that distinction between weakly epistemic and strongly epistemic views of emergence comes in.
Remind me what those mean.
A weakly epistemic view, which is Broad's view, says our inability to deduce emergent properties.
It's not just because we're not smart enough or our science isn't advanced enough.
It reflects a real fact about the world. Those properties are genuinely new, not just complex arrangements of old stuff.
So there's a limit to what we can know by just analyzing the parts.
And that limit tells us something about reality itself.
Whereas a strongly epistemic view would say it's all just a